In a courtroom filled with the sterile echo of whispers, a man in a black robe sat at the bench, his face a mask of authority, his gaze sharp and unwavering. Today was no different from any other for him except for the woman standing before him, her name barely registered in his mind. As he glanced down at the paper, he had already decided her fate. In the few minutes it took to read the charge, she had been caught in a small theft, an act of desperation or greed, depending on who was asking. But that was all it was to him, a simple case that could be resolved with the usual sentence, and little thought required. Yet something in her demeanor caught his attention. She did not look nervous or frightened. In fact, she looked almost detached, as if she were watching someone else's trial. He had seen it before in hardened criminals, in people who had lost hope, or who had been broken by the system. But this woman was different. She was young, her face smooth and calm, but her eyes told another story. There was a strength in those eyes, a resolve that struck him as unusual for someone in her position. He had seen this before too, but rarely in people like her, and he was careful not to let it cloud his judgment. He had to maintain control, had to make sure she knew who was in charge here, that her fate rested in his hands. He knew the statistics, he knew the racial disparities, he knew all too well the challenges faced by people like her. But those things did not matter in his courtroom. He had his rules, and they were simple. You break the law, you pay the price. No exceptions. No matter who you were or where you came from, it was his job to uphold the law, to be impartial, even when it was uncomfortable or inconvenient. And so he did what he had done countless times before he handed down the sentence. No hesitation, no mercy, just a swift decision that would hopefully close the case quickly and move things along. He did not notice the small shift in her expression when he spoke her fate, or how her lips barely moved, as if she were silently agreeing with the outcome he had chosen. She stood tall, unmoving, her posture straight like a soldier awaiting orders. It was almost as if she were waiting for something else to happen, as if she knew something he didn't. The gavel came down with a sharp crack, and the room buzzed with the usual murmur of relief or dismay, depending on which side of the courtroom you stood on. He barely noticed the way her eyes lingered on him for a moment before she turned and walked away without a word. The courtroom dissolved into its usual routine. The next case called, the next judge returning to the monotony of daily work. The sentence was over and done with. No one thought much of it. The woman's name would fade from memory as quickly as it had come into the room. He did not know her story, not yet. He did not know who she was, or what she had done, or why she had chosen to face him today. He would not learn for a few more days. The impact of his judgment would ripple outward without him even realizing it yet. And as he sat in his chambers later that day reviewing new cases, the thought of the woman with the quiet eyes barely crossed his mind. But it would not be long before everything changed, and he would realize just how wrong he had been, just how little he truly knew about the woman he had sentenced to a future that was not yet written for her or for him. As the judge moved through his usual routine over the following days, the name of the woman faded into the background of his mind, her case, a small blip on the radar of his otherwise busy docket. He rarely thought of the faces in his courtroom after the gavel came down, their stories blurred together with all the others. But there was something about her that lingered just at the edges of his thoughts. It wasn't the case itself, but the way she had stood so still. Her eyes had stayed with him. Even after she had left the courtroom, they were steady like a lighthouse in a storm. And though he couldn't explain it, something told him that the woman was not as simple as she seemed. Still, he kept his distance. He had learned long ago not to let the personal intrude into his professional life. But the more he tried to push the memory of her aside, the more it seemed to press in on him, until it was impossible to ignore. A week later, the judge was seated at his desk, reviewing a new batch of cases, when his assistant entered the room, her voice breaking through the silence. He looked up briefly, nodding for her to speak. As she handed him a news clipping from a local paper, she had a hesitant look on her face, as if unsure whether or not to interrupt, but she had seen something he needed to see. He took the paper from her without saying a word and began to read. The headline stopped him cold. It was her, the woman from his courtroom, her picture staring up at him from the page. She wasn't the typical face you'd expect to see in a criminal case, certainly not the kind of person who would be written up in a positive light after a conviction. She was standing in front of a group of people, her hand raised in solidarity, a crowd of young faces behind her. She was wearing a simple shirt with a logo that read "Justice for All," and though the picture was far from glamorous, she exuded a quiet confidence he didn't recognize at first, but that familiar glint in her eyes was unmistakable. It was the same look she had given him in the courtroom. Something told him there was more to her than the charges she had faced. He scanned the article in silence, his heart sinking slightly as he read on. She was described as a prominent activist, working tirelessly for racial justice, advocating for the very communities he had never thought to consider in the same way, a powerful voice in the fight against systemic oppression, a voice that had been standing up for years pushing for reform. And yet here she was facing charges in his courtroom, accused of stealing an item worth little more than a few dollars. He frowned as he reread the article, now fully aware of the disconnect in his own mind. He had sentenced a woman who had spent her life fighting for justice, without even knowing her name or the work she had done in the world beyond the walls of his courtroom. It was as though he had never bothered to see her as anything more than the label on her case, file, a statistic, a defendant. And yet there she was in the news, front and center in the fight for what was right. He pushed the paper aside and sat back in his chair, a heavy sense of discomfort settling in. The guilt gnawed at him, a creeping feeling that he had misjudged her, and perhaps misjudged many others. Before her was this the way he always saw people who looked like her, people who had come from the same neighborhoods, the same struggles? Was he simply blind to their humanity because he had been trained to see only the law and the evidence without considering the bigger picture? He closed his eyes and let out a long breath. He had never questioned his judgment before. He had always assumed he knew exactly what to do, what the right decision was. And now he wasn't so sure. Perhaps he had allowed his biases to guide him. Perhaps his judgment had been clouded by a lifetime of assumptions about people who were different from him. And in that moment he knew that he needed to learn more about her, to understand why she had ended up in his courtroom, and how someone like her had become part of a system that had long since failed to see the full picture. He reached for his phone, his fingers hesitating over the screen. He had no idea where this would lead, but something told him he couldn't just let this go, not without understanding who she was and what she truly stood for. The judge sat still for a long moment, staring at the phone in his hand, his mind racing as he considered his next move. He had never been one to second-guess his decisions before, but now everything seemed uncertain. What if he had misjudged her? What if there was more to her story than he had assumed? He knew the woman's name now, but he didn't know her story, not truly. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized how little he had bothered to understand the lives of the people who came before him in his courtroom. He had always seen the cases as just the cases, numbers, facts, evidence. But now he saw something different, something more human, something he had been ignoring for years. He opened the phone's search engine and typed her name. The results were immediate. Dozens of articles popped up. Her face appeared again and again, this time not as a criminal, but as an activist, a leader, a voice in the movement for justice. As he read through the articles, he found himself drawn to the details of her work. She had been instrumental in organizing protests against police brutality, had worked closely with local schools to implement programs for at-risk youth, and had even started her own nonprofit focused on providing legal resources to people caught in the same cycle of poverty and oppression that she had once experienced. He couldn't believe what he was reading. How had he not known any of this? He had sentenced someone who was clearly doing more good in the world than he had ever done in his own life. But it wasn't just the magnitude of her work that struck him. It was the way she had been living in the shadows of the justice system, the very system that had now turned its gaze on her. As a criminal, he realized that he had never even considered the possibility that someone like her might end up in his courtroom. No, he had been so blinded by the facts in front of him, so focused on his role in enforcing the law, that he had never even considered the deeper reasons behind the actions of the people who came before him, what drove them, who they were beyond the charges they faced. He scrolled further through the pages, reading about the rallies she had led, about the speeches she had given. He was astonished at the contrast between the woman in the courtroom and the woman he was reading about now. How had he not seen it? Why had he assumed that the person standing in front of him was nothing more than the sum of her mistakes? The woman who had fought so hard for justice had found herself caught in the very system She had been trying to reform. The irony of it was almost unbearable. How had it happened? He asked himself. How had she fallen so far from the path of righteousness? He couldn't fathom it, but it was clear now that her actions had been driven by something larger than a simple desire for personal gain, something that the judge hadn't understood in the moment, something that had been lost in the legal process, that had reduced her to a set of facts. He leaned back in his chair, feeling the weight of the injustice settle over him. He realized that this case wasn't just about a single individual anymore. It was about something far larger. It was about the systemic forces that shaped people's lives. Whether they knew it or not, whether they were fighting for change or simply trying to survive, the woman had been a part of that struggle, but now she was paying the price for it. The judge knew that his initial decision had been wrong, but he also knew that simply recognizing it wasn't enough. He had to act. He had to do something more than just apologize. He had to understand the systems that had led her here, and he had to make sure that this didn't happen again, that he didn't continue to contribute to the cycle that had kept people like her trapped. He placed his phone down and rubbed his eyes for a moment. He felt a deep weariness that he hadn't felt before, but there was also a sense of clarity, a sense that the path ahead would not be easy, but it was one he had to walk if he was going to make any real difference in his work. The judge sat in the dimly lit room, staring at the screen of his phone. As the weight of what he had just uncovered pressed down on him, he knew he couldn't go back to business as usual. He had to confront this truth. Somehow he couldn't pretend anymore that the legal system was a perfect machine that ran solely on rules and logic. There were too many cracks, too many hidden biases that shaped the way people were treated, and he had been a part of that system for too long to pretend he hadn't played a role in perpetuating it. He leaned forward, his elbows on the desk, his fingers rubbing his temples, as if he could massage away the nagging feeling of guilt that had taken root inside him. He couldn't shake the image of the woman's eyes, the calmness with which she had stood before him in the courtroom as he sentenced her to a future shaped by the very biases. He was only now beginning to see he had assumed so much about her based on nothing more than her race, her appearance, her case file. None of it had told him the whole story. None of it had explained the force of her spirit, the power of her work, the difference she had made in her community. And now he wondered how many other cases he had handled in the same way, how many people had walked into his courtroom and been reduced to a single act, a single moment, a label that had shaped their entire future. He thought about his colleagues, the other judges he had worked with over the years. They were all like him, weren't they? They too followed the rules without questioning whether the rules themselves were flawed. They too passed sentences without ever truly seeing the people before them. And he wondered how many of them had missed the bigger picture, how many of them had failed to recognize the forces that shaped the lives of the people who came before them. It was then that he realized that he wasn't the only one who needed to change. If he wanted to make a real difference, he couldn't do it alone. This wasn't just his problem, it was a systemic problem. And if he truly wanted to see justice served, he needed to be part of the solution, not just the enforcement mechanism. He felt a sense of resolve building inside him. But it was tempered by uncertainty. How could he fix this? What could he do to make up for the damage he had caused? How could he undo the harm of a decision he had already made? How could he make things right for her and for the others who had been swept up in the same system he had long been a part of? He knew that simply overturning the sentence wouldn't be enough. It wouldn't be enough to fix the harm or to make the system any less broken. He needed to do more. But what was the right next step? Where did he begin? He had to start by understanding her better. He needed to learn about the woman he had sentenced, not just as a defendant in a criminal case, but as a person who had lived a life beyond the walls of his courtroom. He needed to understand the choices she had made, the circumstances that had shaped her actions. He couldn't just make assumptions based on what he had seen. He needed to see her for who she truly was. And so he made a decision. He would reach out to her. He didn't know how or when, but he knew he had to find a way to speak to her. He had to hear her side of the story. He had to know why she had done what she had done. And perhaps more importantly, he needed to hear from her how the system had failed her, how it had failed so many others like her. He knew that this was a risk. He didn't know what her reaction would be. He didn't know if she would even want to speak to him. But he also knew that he couldn't move forward without at least trying to make amends in whatever way he could. The judge stood up from his desk and walked over to the window staring out at the city below, a city full of people who were living in a system that had failed them. He wondered how many others were out there just like her, how many others had been overlooked, dismissed, or misunderstood by the very people who were supposed to deliver justice. He sighed deeply, knowing that this was only the beginning of a long road ahead, one that would require him to confront everything he had known and everything he had believed about the system he had spent his life upholding. The judge sat at his desk for hours, unable to shake the thought of the woman he had sentenced. He had thought about reaching out to her directly, but the more he thought about it, the more unsure he became. How could he explain to her that he had failed her? How could he make her understand that he wasn't the man who had made that decision just a few days ago? Not in the way she must have seen him. How could he possibly make up for the harm he had caused? He decided to do something he hadn't done in years. He called a meeting with his court clerk, asking for all the information she could gather about the woman's case. He needed the full picture, everything from the day of her arrest to the final verdict. He needed to see the trail of events that had led her into his courtroom, because he realized now that understanding her wasn't just about understanding the woman standing before him. It was about understanding the whole system that had shaped her life and her choices, and the roles that he and others like him had played in it. The clerk brought the files the following day, placing them on his desk. With a quiet respect, she had seen his increasing unease, and though she didn't speak of it, she knew something was different about this case. She left him alone with the documents, and he began to read carefully, piece by piece. He saw that the woman had been born into a neighborhood rife with poverty and violence, the kind of neighborhood where opportunities seemed few and far between. Her parents had worked long hours just to make ends meet, and though they had done their best to provide for her, they had struggled in ways he could never fully understand. Growing up, she had faced many of the challenges that defined her community and had navigated them with resilience. Despite the odds, she had excelled in school, had gone on to college, and eventually become a force in local activism. Her path had not been easy, but it was one she had carved for herself. Despite the obstacles, he learned that her involvement in the criminal justice system had not been the result of a life of crime, but the result of years of fighting against a system that had repeatedly failed to support her or her community. He read through the motions of her case, the reports, the witnesses, the charges, and he saw the stark contrast between the woman he had sentenced and the system that had led to her actions. The theft she had committed had been a desperate one, and he saw now that it wasn't just an act of selfishness or criminal intent. It was a moment of survival, the last-ditch effort to make ends meet in the face of an unjust world that had given her so few options to turn to. He couldn't help but think back to the way he had looked at her in court, the assumptions he had made based on nothing more than a few brief moments. In a sterile courtroom, he had seen the evidence and the law, but he had not seen her. He had not seen the depth of her struggle, the fight that had brought her to that point. He felt a knot form in his stomach as he thought about how quick he had been to pass judgment, how easily he had dismissed her humanity. And in that moment, the judge knew that the guilt he had been carrying was not just about this one case. It was about every case, every person he had ever sentenced. Without truly seeing them, he closed his eyes and let the gravity of his responsibility sink in. It wasn't just the woman he had wronged, it was the countless others who had walked through his courtroom doors, whose lives had been reduced to a set of facts, a set of charges. He couldn't undo the past, he knew that, but he also knew that he had to do something now to make sure that the future was different. He couldn't change the system by himself, but he could start by confronting his own role in it. He decided then that he would find a way to meet with her, not just to apologize, but to listen to her, to understand what had driven her, what had led her to make the choices she had made. He didn't know where this would lead, but he knew he couldn't move forward without taking this first step. He made a note to contact her lawyer to arrange a meeting. He wasn't sure how it would go, or if she would even be willing to speak to him, but he knew he had to try for both their sakes, and for the sake of the justice he had sworn to serve. The judge didn't expect an easy response when his office received a call from her lawyer. The next day, he had been bracing for the possibility that she might refuse to speak with him, that she might see him as just another part of the system that had wronged her, and he wouldn't blame her for it. But when the lawyer called him back, he was surprised by what he heard. The lawyer explained that the woman was willing to meet, But under one condition, she wanted the conversation to take place on her terms. She would not meet in his office, but in a neutral location somewhere away from the courtroom, away from the system that had judged her so many times before. The judge understood immediately. It was clear that this was not going to be a simple exchange of apologies. It would not be a conversation where he could simply walk in with a brief apology and leave feeling absolved. No, this was going to be an opportunity for her to speak her truth, for him to hear not just about the case, but about everything that had led her here, everything that had shaped her choices, her life, her activism, and the struggle she had faced in a world that had so often turned its back on her. It took several days to arrange the meeting, and when the day finally came, the judge felt a knot in his stomach. He had never been in a situation like this before. He had sat across from defendants many times, but this felt different. This was not a case. This was not a simple matter of guilt or innocence. It was a chance to see someone as a person, to hear their story, to understand their humanity. And he wondered if he was truly ready for what she might say. When he arrived at the small cafe where they had agreed to meet, he found her already sitting at a table in the corner. She was dressed simply in jeans and a jacket, her hair pulled back in a ponytail, and she looked every bit as unassuming as she had in the courtroom. But there was something different about her today, something that made her stand out in a way that was impossible to ignore. Her eyes were the same steady eyes that had held him in the courtroom, but today they seemed even more intense, more focused, as if she were ready to confront him and the world around her with the same quiet strength that had led her through years of fighting for justice. He took a deep breath and approached the table. She looked up as he drew near and nodded in acknowledgement, but didn't say a word. He sat down slowly, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The silence between them felt heavy but not uncomfortable. It was as if they both knew that this conversation would not be an ordinary one, and it would not be solved with small talk. The judge cleared his throat and began to speak, but she stopped him with a raised hand. Her voice was calm but firm when she spoke. She told him that she had agreed to meet with him because she wanted him to understand something about her, but also about the system he represented, about the system that had been built to oppress people like her, people like so many others. She said she wasn't there to make him feel guilty or to accept his apology. She was there to make him see what he had missed, what he had ignored for so long. She spoke about the way the justice system had failed her and so many others like her, how it had been designed to lock people into cycles of poverty and criminality rather than provide them with the support they needed to thrive. She talked about the years she had spent working to reform the system and how frustrating it had been to realize that the very people who held power in the courts were often blind to the very issues they were supposed to be addressing, how judges and lawyers and police officers could never truly understand what it was like to live in a community where violence and poverty were everyday realities, where justice often felt like a foreign concept, how every day felt like a fight to survive, and how sometimes that meant making decisions that others would never understand. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't speak with anger. But there was a quiet fire in her words that cut through the judge like a knife. He listened carefully as she laid out her experiences, the struggles, the heartache, the moments of clarity and doubt, and he found himself overwhelmed by the enormity of what she was saying, overwhelmed by how little he had truly understood about the lives of the people who walked through his courtroom doors. He had always believed in the system. He had always believed that the law was fair and just. But she was showing him how far from the truth that belief really was, how much the system was rigged against the very people it was supposed to protect. The judge sat back in his chair, and for the first time he allowed himself to really hear her, to really understand the depth of her pain and her hope. All at once he realized that her story was not just her own. It was the story of countless others who had been swallowed by a system that had never been designed to uplift them. He didn't know how to respond at first, but then he simply said thank you. He wasn't sure what else he could say, but in that moment he knew that this conversation was the beginning of something bigger, something that would change the way he saw his work forever. The woman didn't respond immediately to the judge's simple thank you. Instead, she took a long pause, as if weighing the sincerity of his words before speaking again. She told him that she hadn't expected him to have all the answers, that she wasn't looking for a miracle or for him to change overnight, but that she needed him to know how deeply the system had hurt people like her, people like so many others who were too often caught in the crossfire of policies and practices that never took their lives or their struggles into account. She looked at him then, and for the first time since they had met, he felt as if she were seeing him not as a judge, not as part of the system, but as a person, someone who had the power to make a difference if he chose to. She said that the hardest part of her work had never been fighting against the obvious injustices, it had been fighting against the indifference, the way so many people simply accepted things as they were without questioning why things had become the way they were, without seeing the systemic failures that kept people in chains, both literal and figurative. It wasn't just the laws themselves, it was the attitudes of those who enforced them, the way judges, lawyers, police officers, and even the public saw people who came from neighborhoods like hers as somehow less deserving of compassion or understanding. She told him that she had always believed that people could change, that people could learn and grow, that no one was beyond redemption, but that only worked if they were given the tools to change and the opportunities to prove it. She spoke about how the criminal justice system had robbed so many people of their chances by locking them into cycles of punishment that only deepened their struggles. She talked about how incarceration often led to more crime, not less, how it had torn apart families and communities, and how it had created a system where the very people who needed help the most were the ones most likely to be punished. She said she had worked for years trying to change these systems and had seen some success, but there was still so much work to be done. And that meant reaching people like him who had the power to influence the way the system worked, to make sure that justice wasn't just something that was handed down, but something that was actually served. She paused again, this time her gaze softening as she looked at him, and asked if he could see it, if he could see what she was saying. And for the first time in a long time, the judge felt the walls he had built around himself start to crumble. He had spent so many years hiding behind his position, behind the law, behind the idea that he was just a neutral party, that his job was to follow the rules and not question them. But the woman sitting across from him had shattered that illusion, and in doing so she had made him realize something important, that justice wasn't just about enforcing laws, it was about understanding the people who came before him, understanding their stories and their struggles, and making sure that the system he had sworn to uphold was actually serving them in a way that was fair and not just according to the letter of the law, but according to the spirit of it. The judge felt a sense of weight settle over him. It was like he had been given a responsibility that he hadn't asked for, but that he couldn't ignore. He knew that he could never unsee what she had shown him. He couldn't go back to the way things had been before. He couldn't simply go back to issuing sentences without considering the people who stood before him as individuals with their own lives, their own dreams, their own pain, and their own potential. He knew that the road ahead would be difficult, that it would require him to confront his own biases and blind spots, to be willing to look at the justice system not as a fixed institution, but as something that could be changed and improved. But he also knew that he had to take that first step. He had to start somewhere, and this conversation, this moment with her, was where it began. It was a turning point in his life, one that he couldn't ignore, and one that he didn't want to forget. He stood up slowly and extended his hand to her. She looked at it for a moment before reaching out and shaking it. Her grip was firm and steady, just like her presence. He told her that he would do better, that he would work to understand the system more fully, and that he would take her words to heart. She didn't say anything more, but he saw the quiet acknowledgement in her eyes, and he knew that for the first time in a long time he had truly listened, and that was enough for now. The days following their meeting were a blur for the judge. He had returned to his office with a new sense of urgency, a quiet but insistent feeling that he couldn't go back to the way things had been before. He couldn't continue to ignore the things he had learned about the system he had spent his career upholding. He knew he had a lot of work to do. He couldn't undo the mistakes he had made in the past, but he could start to shift his perspective and hopefully influence those around him to do the same. He spent the next few weeks reading everything he could find about the intersection of race, poverty, and the criminal justice system. He dove into books, research papers, articles that explored the hidden biases within the courts, the ways in which people of color were disproportionately affected by policies that were supposed to help them. and the systemic injustices that had perpetuated the cycles of poverty and incarceration. He began to attend seminars and workshops to learn from experts in the field, to hear the voices of those who had lived through the system and who understood its failings better than anyone else. He didn't do this to absolve himself or to make himself feel better about what he had done. He did it because he knew that in order to truly make a difference, he had to understand the problem in its full complexity. He began speaking to other judges as well, but he didn't start by confronting them directly about their own biases. He knew that would be too much too soon. Instead, he asked them to come with him to listen to speakers who were actively working to change the system. He invited them to sit in on panels where formerly incarcerated people shared their stories of survival and transformation. He wanted to show them what he had learned and to help them see things the way he now saw them. Slowly but surely, the conversations began to shift. Little by little, more and more of his colleagues started to see the cracks in the system that he had once ignored, and it became clear that change was possible, though it would take time and patience. There were some who resisted, of course, who clung to the idea that the law was the law, and that any deviation from its rigid boundaries was dangerous. But even they couldn't deny the statistics, the stories, the facts that were laid out before them. They couldn't ignore the truth of what was happening to so many people who walked into their courtrooms, people who had been sentenced before they were ever given a chance to explain the circumstances of their lives. And those who began to listen began to question their own assumptions, and eventually they too began to see the importance of understanding the bigger picture. And though he didn't know it yet, the judge's shift in perspective was beginning to have an impact beyond his own courtroom. Slowly, the ripples of his change spread to the other judges, and even to the lawyers and advocates he worked with. The conversations were becoming more thoughtful and nuanced as they began to consider not just the facts of a case, but the lives of the people behind those facts. As the weeks turned into months, the judge knew that this was only the beginning. The road ahead was long and full of challenges, but he was no longer afraid of confronting the hard truths he had been avoiding for so long. He had learned that justice wasn't just about punishment. It was about understanding, and it was about recognizing that the law was not neutral, and that it could never be until all people were treated equally under it, and that required real change that couldn't come from simply following the same old patterns and practices. He thought about the woman he had sentenced. Often as time passed, he wondered where she was, what she was doing, and if she was still working in the same ways he had read about in the articles. He hoped she was. He hoped that her work was continuing, and that she was still fighting for the very people the system had forgotten about. But he also hoped that she knew that her words had changed him in ways that would ripple through the years to come. He would never forget the conversation they had shared, or the way her presence had forced him to confront the flaws in the system he had long been a part of. He knew that he couldn't fix everything, but he could make sure that the next person who came before him would be seen, fully heard, completely, and given a chance to tell their story without prejudice, without bias, and without fear of being condemned, before they even had a chance to explain themselves. As he sat in his office one afternoon, reviewing the case that had been brought before him, he realized with a quiet sense of certainty that he had become a different kind of judge, the kind who no longer simply followed the law, but the kind who understood its human cost and was ready to make decisions that took that cost into account. It wasn't a perfect change, and it wouldn't always be easy, but it was a start, and that was enough for now.